Venezuela has just moved to severely restrict oil exports to the United States, cutting off a supply line that American refineries have depended on for decades. I'm John Mearsheimer, and I've been arguing for years that the unipolar moment is over, that American dominance is not a permanent condition, that power shifts, and when it does, the rules change. What just happened with Venezuela is not an anomaly. It's not desperation. It's proof of everything I've been saying about the structural transformation of international politics. This is a calculated strike at the heart of a relationship built on extraction, interference, and the assumption that Caracas would always bend to pressure. And what's happening behind this decision is a complete inversion of power dynamics that Washington refuses to acknowledge. So let me explain to you, using the framework of offensive realism, why this matters, why it was inevitable, and why it's just the beginning. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we need to go back to the late 1990s when Hugo Chavez took power and began reshaping Venezuela's relationship with its own resources. For decades before Chavez, Venezuela operated as a compliant oil supplier to the United States. American companies had significant control over extraction. Refining contracts were favorable to Washington. The profits flowed northward while inequality deepened in Caracas and beyond. This was the model. Venezuela produced, America consumed, and the political class in Caracas accepted the arrangement because it kept them in power and kept the system stable. This is what I call the logic of hegemony. When you're the dominant power in a region, you can structure relationships to serve your interests. Smaller states comply not because they love you, but because the costs of resistance are too high. Then Chavez nationalized the oil industry. He redirected revenues towards social programs. He challenged the Organization of American States. He built alliances with Cuba, with Russia, with China. And Washington watched as a country it had long considered within its sphere of influence began to drift away. The response was predictable. The United States supported a coup attempt in 2002. When that failed, it began funding opposition groups, applying diplomatic pressure, and isolating Venezuela in international forums. But here's what's interesting. The oil kept flowing. Even as tensions grew, American refineries on the Gulf Coast continued processing hundreds of thousands of barrels of Venezuelan heavy crude every single day. Why? Because those refineries were built for that specific type of oil. Switching suppliers is not simple. It requires infrastructure changes, new contracts, and time. So the relationship continued, tense but functional, held together by mutual dependence. This is a key concept in international relations. Interdependence can constrain even great powers. America needed Venezuelan oil just as much as Venezuela needed American markets. Then in 2017, the sanctions era began. The Trump administration imposed restrictions on Venezuelan debt. Then it sanctioned the state oil company PDVSA. Then it froze billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets held in American banks. The Biden administration continued the policy with only minor adjustments. The goal was clear: collapse the Venezuelan economy, force regime change, and reinstall a government friendly to American interests. Now, from a realist perspective, this made a certain kind of sense. If you can strangle a rival's economy without firing a shot, why wouldn't you? Economic coercion is cheaper than military intervention and carries fewer domestic political costs. But there was a fundamental miscalculation here, and it's one I see repeated over and over in American foreign policy. The assumption was that Venezuela had no choice. Without access to American markets, without the ability to use the dollar for transactions, without international legitimacy, Caracas would eventually capitulate. This assumption was based on a unipolar worldview. It assumed that America's structural power was so overwhelming that resistance was futile. The sanctions were devastating, make no mistake. Oil production fell from over 3 million barrels per day to below 500,000 at the lowest point. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Millions fled the country. International trade nearly stopped. Yet the government in Caracas survived. It adapted. It found new buyers in China and India. It rebuilt parts of its infrastructure with help from Russia and Iran. And it waited. This is what I mean when I talk about the importance of understanding power transitions. The world was changing underneath American policymakers' feet, but they were still operating with outdated assumptions. Sanctions can devastate economies, but they don't automatically produce political outcomes. In fact, they often produce the opposite. They rally domestic support around besieged governments. They create incentives for sanctioned states to cooperate with each other, and they accelerate the development of alternative economic systems that reduce dependence on the West. What changed? The world began shifting toward multipolarity. This is the core of my argument about contemporary international politics. The unipolar moment, that brief period after the Cold War when America stood alone as the world's sole superpower, is over. China has become an economic superpower capable of offering financing, trade, and political cover to nations that defy the West. Russia retains significant military power and energy resources. Regional powers like India, Turkey, and Brazil are asserting independence. In this environment, the costs of defying the United States have decreased and the benefits have increased. Let me be precise about what I mean by structural shift. Power in international politics is not just about military capability or GDP, it's about the options available to states and the constraints they face. In a unipolar system, a small state like Venezuela has few options. Defying the hegemon means isolation, economic collapse, or military intervention. Compliance is rational because resistance is futile. But in a multipolar system, small states have choices. They can play great powers against each other. They can find alternative patrons. They can survive economic warfare by diversifying their relationships. Venezuela calculated that it could survive sanctions, rebuild its economy through alternative partnerships, and use its oil resources as leverage in a tight global market. That calculation was correct. And here's what's crucial. This wasn't just about Venezuela's agency. The structural conditions made this possible. China needed energy and was willing to pay. India wanted discounted crude amid global price volatility. Russia and Iran shared expertise on managing isolated economies. Venezuela didn't act alone. It acted as part of a coalition of sanctioned and semi-aligned states building parallel systems. This is the multipolar world I've been describing. It's not about ideology or values. It's about the distribution of power, creating space for alternatives to American hegemony. So let's look at what actually happened in recent months. In late 2024, the Venezuelan government announced it would prioritize oil exports to Asia and reduce shipments to the United States by more than 60%. This was not framed as retaliation. It was framed as economic pragmatism. Chinese and Indian buyers were offering better terms, paying in currencies other than the dollar, and not attaching political conditions to their purchases. Within weeks, Venezuelan crude shipments to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries dropped from roughly 400,000 barrels per day to under 150,000. Refinery operators in Texas and Louisiana began scrambling for alternatives. Some turned to Canadian heavy crude, but the logistics were complicated and the chemistry was different. Others looked to Mexico, but Mexican production has been declining for years and cannot fill the gap. The official statements from Caracas were measured but pointed. Venezuela's oil minister declared that the country would no longer accept being treated as a subordinate supplier while facing continuous economic warfare. There was no mention of reversing the decision. There was no negotiation offer. This was presented as a done deal. Now American officials downplayed the situation. The State Department said the U.S. energy sector was resilient and could adapt. The Department of Energy pointed to strategic reserves and domestic production increases. But behind the scenes, industry insiders were alarmed. Gulf Coast refineries are critical infrastructure, and they were designed decades ago with Venezuelan heavy crude in mind. What traditional media is not telling you is that this was not a sudden decision. Venezuela has been quietly diversifying its export markets for more than 3 years. Agreements with Chinese state oil companies were signed as early as 2021. Indian refiners began increasing purchases in 2022. What you're seeing now is the culmination of a long-term strategy, not a reaction to a recent event. And the timing is deliberate. Global oil markets are tight. OPEC Plus has been managing supply carefully. The war in Ukraine disrupted Russian exports to Europe. U.S. strategic reserves were drawn down significantly and have not been fully replenished. In this environment, losing access to 400,000 barrels per day of heavy crude is not trivial. It puts pressure on prices. It forces costly adjustments, and it exposes the vulnerability of a system that assumed compliant suppliers would always be available. Let me explain something about the logic of sanctions that most people miss. Once you impose sanctions, lifting them becomes a political problem. It looks like weakness. It rewards defiance. So even when sanctions clearly aren't working, governments are reluctant to reverse course. This creates what I call the credibility trap. The policy fails, but admitting failure is too costly, so the policy continues and the failure deepens. Venezuela exploited that trap perfectly. It endured the pain, found alternatives, and now operates from a stronger position than it did 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the United States is left with refineries that cannot easily replace Venezuelan crude, higher energy costs, and a diminished reputation for strategic competence. This goes back to a fundamental principle of power politics. Credibility matters. When you threaten consequences, and those consequences don't produce the desired outcome, your credibility erodes. And once lost, credibility is difficult to rebuild. For the United States, this presents a strategic dilemma. Maintaining dominance requires credibility, but credibility requires successful outcomes. When sanctions fail, when coercion backfires, when allies drift away, credibility erodes. The assumption in Washington was that economic pain would translate into political surrender, but history shows that's rarely the case. States endure extraordinary hardship when their leadership believes survival is at stake, and they become more, not less, resistant to external pressure. Venezuela's decision to block oil exports to the United States is a rational response to what I would call an irrational policy. Washington treated Venezuela as a subordinate that could be coerced indefinitely. Caracas responded by finding new patrons, new markets, and new sources of legitimacy. Now, this is not just about Venezuela. This is part of a broader trend that validates everything I've been arguing about the multipolar world. Watch what's happening across Latin America. Mexico is asserting energy sovereignty and limiting foreign investment in its oil sector. Brazil is expanding trade with China and participating in BRICS discussions about alternative currencies. Argentina is exploring yuan-denominated trade deals. Bolivia and Nicaragua are deepening ties with Russia. This is not coincidence. This is a region reevaluating its relationship with Washington and finding that alternatives exist. The era of the Monroe Doctrine, even in its modern forms, is ending. Not because America chose to step back, but because the conditions that enabled dominance have changed. And there's a critical financial dimension here. Venezuela is increasingly conducting oil sales in yuan, in rupees, and through barter arrangements that bypass the dollar entirely. This reduces the effectiveness of U.S. financial sanctions and contributes to the gradual erosion of dollar dominance in global energy markets. Every transaction that occurs outside the dollar system weakens the primary tool of American economic coercion. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency depends on network effects. It's valuable because everyone uses it. But if enough actors start using alternatives, those network effects weaken. Russia sells energy in rubles and yuan. China promotes the yuan for trade settlement. Saudi Arabia discusses non-dollar oil sales. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a system under stress. So what does this mean going forward? In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see more resource-rich countries leveraging tight markets to assert political and economic independence. We will see more cooperation among sanctioned states. we will see more institutions and financial systems designed to operate outside Western control. The BRICS bloc is expanding. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is deepening. Alternative payment systems are being developed. These efforts are still in early stages, but the trajectory is clear. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and the tools that maintained it are losing effectiveness. Venezuela has demonstrated that even a relatively small country under immense pressure can resist a superpower if it finds the right partners and waits for the right moment. The question now is not whether other countries will follow, but how many and how quickly. Caracas is not begging for sanctions relief. It's moving forward without American approval. It's selling oil to buyers who pay fairly and respect sovereignty. It's rebuilding its economy on terms it controls. This is what the multipolar world looks like. States pursue their interests based on the constraints and opportunities created by the distribution of power. When that distribution shifts, behavior changes accordingly. What we're witnessing is not a temporary disruption, it's a fundamental recalibration of power. The unipolar moment is over, the multipolar world is here, and Venezuela just proved it.